Welcome to Ican. Comes of Age for Alcoholics Anonymous. Chapter 2. The 3 Legacies of Alcoholics Anonymous. Unity, the second legacy. The 12 Traditions. 1. Our common welfare should come first. Personal recovery depends upon AA unity. 2. For our group purpose there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. Our leaders are but trusted servants, they do not govern. 3. The only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. 4. Each group should be autonomous, except in matters affecting other groups or AA as a whole. 5. Each group has but one primary purpose, to carry its message to the alcoholic who still suffers. 6. An AA group ought never endorse, finance, or lend the AA name to any related facility or outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary purpose. 7. Every AA group ought to be fully self-supporting, declining outside contributions. 8. Alcoholics Anonymous should remain forever non-professional, but our service centers may employ special workers. 9. AA, as such, ought never to be organized, but we may create service boards or committees directly responsible to those they serve. 10. Alcoholics Anonymous has no opinion on outside issues, hence the AA name ought never to be drawn into public controversy. 11. Our public relations policy is based on attraction rather than promotion. We need always maintain personal anonymity at the level of press, radio, and films. 12. Anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all our traditions, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities. Today we in AA are together, and we know we are going to stay together. We are at peace with each other and with the world around us. So many of our conflicts are resolved that our destiny seems secure. The problems of yesterday have produced the blessings of today. Ours is not the usual success story, rather it is the story of how, under God's grace, an unsuspected strength has arisen out of great weakness, of how, under threats of disunity and collapse, worldwide unity and brotherhood have been forged. In the course of this experience we have evolved a set of traditional principles by which we live and work together and relate ourselves as a fellowship to the world around us. These principles are called the 12 Traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous. They represent the distilled experience of our past, and we rely on them to carry us in unity through the challenges and dangers which the future may bring. It was not always so. In the early days we saw that it was one thing for a few alcoholics to get well, but the problem of living and working together was something else. Therefore it was into an uncharted future that we looked from the window of Dr. Bob's living room in 1937 when we first realized that alcoholics might be able to get well in large numbers. The world around us, the world of more normal people, was being torn apart. Could we recovered alcoholics hold together? Could we carry AA's message? Could we function as groups and as a whole? No one could say. Our friends the psychiatrists, with some reason, had begun to warn, this fellowship of alcoholics is emotional dynamite. Its neurotic content can blow it to bits. When drinking we were certainly explosive enough. Now that we were sober, would dry benders and emotional jags blow us up? When I think of explosions I always think of my friend Icky. Down in Houston, Texas, they call him the Dynamite Man. Icky is an expert on explosives, on demolition. He was in the rear of the Russian retreat blowing up bridges during the war. After the war he started to ply his trade again, and I guess he fell into the same error that a poor fellow in London did the other day. This alcoholic Londoner turned up before a magistrate. He had been picked up stiff drunk. His bottle was empty. The magistrate said, "Did you drink it all?" "Oh, yes." "Why did you drink it all?" "Because I lost the cork." Down there in Houston, it must have been one of those days when our friend Icky lost his cork. Icky was commissioned to blow up a certain pier in Houston Harbor, and he blew up the wrong one. The great question in the early days was this: would we blow up or could we stay together? Today we have the answers. This anniversary meeting in St. Louis is a vast testament to the fact that we have held together. Pioneering in AA of course has not stopped. I hope it never will. We feel secure here today, but there are still places out on the AA front in distant lands where right now they are going through all the pains and trials of our early days. For example, the New York office recently received a letter written by a Jesuit priest in India. It told the story of a Hindu schoolteacher who owned a cow and a tiny plot of ground. His wife was stone deaf and he had a sister who, like himself, drank like a fish. His salary as a teacher was about 50 cents a day. The Jesuit translated AA's 12 steps for him, and in spite of his poverty, in spite of his wife's deafness, in spite of his domineering and drunker sister, he was staying sober. We know that this lone Hindu is probably feeling just the same worries that Dr. Bob and I did back there in the living room in Akron. This Hindu pioneer is probably asking, can I hang together myself? Can I carry this message? Will I be able to form a group? Yes, he is asking those very questions. But he will soon be in communication with our world office and we can send solid assurance to that distant outpost that we are with him, all of us, and that our experience is his to draw on. Almost in the same mail a letter came from a Presbyterian minister out on another AA front. He said, for a long time I've been trying to get a group started here in Thailand. Recently a highly educated Thai, speaking fluent English, came along. He was a terrible case of alcoholism, and he desperately wanted to get well. Now he has had a promising period of sobriety and is eager to translate the entire AA literature into Siamese. He and I are already at work, starting groups. Can you give us a hand? The minister continued. We took AA's 12 steps over to the largest Buddhist monastery in this province. We showed them to the priest at the head of it. After he had finished looking over the 12 steps, the monk said, "Why, these are fine. Since we as Buddhists don't understand God just as you do, it might be slightly more acceptable if you inserted the word good in your steps instead of God. Nevertheless, you say in these steps that it is God as you understand him. That clears up the point for us. Yes, AA's 12 steps will certainly be accepted by the Buddhists around here. To some of us, the idea of substituting good for God in the 12 steps may seem like a watering down of AA's message. But here we must remember that AA's steps are suggestions only. A belief in them as they stand is not at all a requirement for membership among us. This liberty has made AA available to thousands who never would have tried at all had we insisted on the 12 steps just as written. But changes in them seldom last, the original version usually wins out. What has proved so true here in America will probably prove true in many a far-off land. Alcoholics may be led to believe in God, but none can be forced. Now what does this all mean? It means that there are going to be AA groups in India and in Thailand and in many other faraway places where alcoholics dwell. They are going to be plagued by our early fears, but we can help them and reassure them. Speaking of fears, a story turned up at the office. It seems that AA had made a start in Tokyo. As usual it began among the American drunks, but then it spread out to the Japanese. Soon there was quite a Japanese contingent, of which we heard very good reports. Then one day a Japanese appeared at the New York office. He had heard that his fellows in the homeland now had AA groups and had begun to write to them to get the inside track. Now, in a state of great alarm, he said, "Awful things are going on over there in Japan. Did you know that they have two kinds of AAs over there? Of course they have the 12 steps just as we have them here. But there is now another AA leader who has written 10 steps and they are charging 100 yen to attend his meetings. Once upon a time that sort of heresy would have scared us to death. Today it is only amusing. We know that they will soon be infiltrated by common sense and experience. They will find that nobody can professionalize AA's 12th step and the elder who means well and does badly will mend his ways. He will finally see that alcoholism is a quest for survival in which the good is sometimes the enemy of the best, and that only the best can bring the true good. Very much more could be told about AA out on its distant reaches. its pioneering fronts. For example, there is an AA night and day radio communication that passes from tankers on the Atlantic over to the Pacific. There is good old Captain Jack on a Standard Oil tanker plying the world ports. He leaves AA literature when he goes ashore, and he looks up bartenders, doctors, and preachers, asking them for prospects. An AA group just recently started in Florence, Italy, because an AA sailor came ashore and got a prospect from a bartender. Many a group starts in such an improbable and fantastic way. It has become almost literally true that where 2 or 3 of us are gathered together in His name, there a group will form. Let me tell you the wonderful legend about that AA group way up toward Point Barrow in Alaska. A couple of prospectors went out and got themselves a cabin and a case of scotch. The weather turned bitter, 50 below, and they got so drunk they let the fire go out. Barely escaping death by freezing, one of them woke up in time to rekindle the fire. He was prowling around outside for fuel, and he looked into an empty oil drum filled with frozen water. Down in the ice cake he saw a reddish-yellow object. They thawed it out, and it turned out to be an AA book. One of the pair read the book and sobered up. The legend has it that he became the founder of one of our farthest north groups, perhaps the one in which we now have plenty of Eskimos. The last I heard about those Alaskan groups was that they were in communication by radio every day with the AA group that functions on the north end of the Greenland ice cap among the men at our air base there. Alcoholics Anonymous got started in Ireland in 1946 when Connor F., an AA tavern owner from Philadelphia, decided to go on a vacation with his wife to the Emerald Isle. When they got to Dublin they both said, "Never mind the vacation, let's start a group here." So they made their way to a local mental hospital, the one endowed by the author, clergyman Swift, and there they found their first man, Richard P. And so AA began to take root in Ireland. The Dublin group, by the way, has achieved a special renown because of its world correspondent, Sackville M., the group's honorable secretary. When it comes to helping alcoholics by mail, he is no doubt the world's champion. The beginning of AA in England in early 1947 was a striking one. Some years ago Bob B., a Canadian mining engineer, went to London, where he met up with Bill H., an alcoholic greengrocer. By correspondence with New York 2 or 3 of the English were already struggling for sobriety. But the appearance of these two upon the scene soon resulted in an active AA group. As a result London and indeed all England is today sprawling with groups. At first, however, they met such resistance in Britain that at one time only the Financial Chronicle would publish an advertisement about AA. All the other English papers were afraid that it was a fraud. The reverse process was seen when a Scottish nobleman, Philip, journeyed to America. He came over to have a look at the international Christian leadership movement, where he met with a group of businessmen who were interested in bringing God into industry through the medium of breakfast clubs for prayer and planning. Philip thought that maybe he could introduce the breakfast club idea to Scotland, and he hoped that such a good work would loosen his fatal attachment to the bottle. At the very first session he met an old-time Philadelphia AA, George R., who gave him AA, right off the spiritual main line. The head of one of Scotland's most ancient clans sobered up on the spot. He took AA back to his native heath, and soon alcoholic Scots were drying up all the way from Glasgow ship chandlers to society folks in Edinburgh. Canadian AA, too, is of the very best. Sometime in 1940 a temperance worker at Toronto showed the AA book to an alcoholic who had resisted all other attempts at rescue. Again the AA book turned the trick, and together these two exposed many a Toronto problem drinker to the AA contagion. And the process of multiplication set in which eventually carried AA to about every city and town in the province of Ontario. This good friend, George Little, a minister as well as a temperance worker, was not a little disappointed that his strange new flock showed no interest whatever in getting everybody bone dry. They insisted they were concerned only with local imbibers who wanted AA. Here it was definitely proved for the first time that AA could never become a dry crusade, a fact which has since puzzled many a worker in the dry cause. This first crossing of the border was followed in 1941 by another, when Windsor, Ontario, just across the river from Detroit, began to harbor Canada's Group No. 2. In Vancouver, British Columbia, a non-alcoholic was also paired with an alcoholic from the very start. This time it was a public-spirited candy manufacturer who passed the book on to Charlie B., a real estate broker. Inspired with the message and full of energy, this pair canvassed the city of Victoria and half the province in a hurry, and soon BC's Alcoholics Anonymous was a reality. After a time the message spread eastward over the prairies of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Montreal meanwhile had begun to simmer. Dave B., the Montreal group's founder and a marathon 12-stepper, had sobered up on reading an AA book sent him by his sister. Here we saw AA's very first French members. I shall forever remember that early bilingual provincial meeting where I first heard the Lord's Prayer in French. In due course, solid AA began to flourish in Newfoundland and the Maritime provinces, and of course it was only a question of time when Quebec City and Trois-Rivières, thus flanked on both sides, would have their own groups. The Quebec clergy, at first doubtful, are today among AA's most ardent well-wishers. So are many public officials. We can never forget the party that Montreal's Mayor Howd once threw for us. It was probably the first official reception that any AA group ever had. As we know, AA literature has a way of turning up in most surprising places. A broker of Johannesburg, South Africa, read an article in the Reader's Digest about us and sent to New York for a pamphlet, which so excited him that he fell like a buzzsaw on the derelict drunks of his city. He had a calling to scrape the bottom of the barrel. As an extra inducement he offered his clients a certain amount of rehabilitation money. Naturally he was flooded by swarms of eager aspirants, who, it soon appeared, were far more interested in handouts than they were in sobriety. Verging on complete wreck, this enterprise was saved by the timely arrival of another drinker, Val D., who had just obtained a copy of the AA book, one reading of which had struck him cold sober. Almost at the same time, another South African, a native of Perth, had sobered up through the book and had gone right to work on the alcoholics in his own town. Through the more orthodox methods of these two devotees of AA's big book, and with reinforcing letters from General Headquarters, things began to hum in South Africa. A whole volume could now be written about our progress down there, telling how AA has grown from these very fragile beginnings. In the latter part of 1942 we began to get our first letters from Australia, from S.J. Minogue, a psychiatrist, associated with Rydalmere Mental Hospital in Sydney, and from a priest, Father Dunley, at the same institution. We furnished them with literature, including the AA book, and a correspondence started with Dr. Minogue which has lasted ever since. Month after month the doctor and the priest labored with their grim cases and were aided by an attendant named Mr. Arch McKinnon. Letter after letter from Dr. Minogue reported no results at all. Indeed, it took over 2 years to produce anything like an AA group. These non-alcoholics had great difficulty in getting the proper identification with their patients, but late in 1944 they finally had success with 2 of them, Ben and Rex, the latter becoming Australia's first AA secretary. In March, 1945, Rex wrote Bobby at the New York office in substance as follows: "Dear Secretary, Dr. Minogue has handed over all of the correspondence to me, he being too fully occupied as superintendent at Rydalmere to answer it himself. It must not be thought, however, that the doctor's interest is flagging, for the contrary is the case. You will be pleased to know that a group has now been formed in Sydney. Our address is above." The movement here was started by Dr. Minogue, Father Dunley, and Mr. McKinnon, a hospital attendant. They are not alcoholics, but they have gathered around themselves 7 or 8 real ones, including myself, and we are netting new recruits every day. We feel that the movement is gathering momentum in Australia, so we now want a formal affiliation with Alcoholics Anonymous. Sincerely yours, Rex A., Secretary. The Aussies were indeed on their way. Australia now has its thousands of members in all walks of life, and on all sides they enjoy the warmest public blessing. The Australia development will certainly be remembered as a seldom matched example of pioneering fortitude and faith. These glimpses of AA worldwide reveal the incredible distance that AA has come since that fall day in 1937 when Dr. Bob and I looked apprehensively toward the future. Then we had only the word-of-mouth program, the substance of the formula for sobriety that Ebby had given me. AA's 12 steps had not yet been written, and the AA book was scarcely an idea. Worldwide service and unity were only dreams. AA's first national development of consequence came in 1939. In September that year, Fulton Ausler, then editor of Liberty magazine, published a piece called Alcoholics and God, written by Morris Markey. About 800 frantic inquiries descended upon us immediately and we wrote to them all. Then came Mr. Rockefeller's dinner in 1940. It was followed by another large number of letters pleading for help. But the really big flood came in March 1941, when Jack Alexander's feature article appeared in the Saturday Evening Post. A real Niagara then broke loose, and we were deluged with letters and with alcoholics by the thousands. This sudden growth ushered in a period of awful uncertainty. The big test of AA's unity began in earnest. We were operating with only the benefit of casual contacts, travelers going from one place to another, letters from the office, one pamphlet, and one book. Could we, on that slender basis, form ourselves into groups that could function and hang together? We simply did not know. Alcoholics in 2s and 3s were tough enough, but if they were gathered in much larger groups, what then? There had already been an ominous foretaste of the problems of mushrooming groups, quarrels over leadership, money, membership, clubs, exploitation of AA's name, panhandling, and even romancing. As the Saturday Evening Post crop of alcoholics tried to form themselves into hundreds of new groups, the specters of disunity and collapse grew to frightening proportions. We could only do our best, and leave the rest to God. Just before the big test fell upon us, one of our New York members named Ray W. went to San Francisco in 1940 to take a sales course. This was another one of those improbable beginnings. Ray had been an atheist and he still stuck to it. Nevertheless, he had been sober a couple of years and was broad-minded enough to take the AA book to San Francisco with him. We handed him a list of inquiries from that area which had been contacted by mail only. When he got to San Francisco, Ray began calling up these people, and a few of them gathered at his hotel. He said to them, "Now, boys, this AA is great stuff. It really saved my life. But there's one feature of it I don't like. I mean this God business. So when you read this book, you can skip that part of it." 10 days later, Ray was on his way back east, leaving a shivering and divided group in his wake. But they soon found two wonderful friends, Mrs. Gordon Oram and Dr. Percy Poliak, a psychiatrist who had been impressed with AA as he had seen it at work in Bellevue Hospital in New York. Now at the San Francisco County Hospital, Dr. Poliak gave the group his full support, and he continued it ever afterward. Mrs. Oram had a boarder, Ted, for whom she had already obtained the AA book. She opened her flat for the first A meeting late in 1939, where salesman Ray's contacts foregathered with Ted. Ted never made the grade. But one John C. did, and he has stayed in the clear ever since. Soon these were joined by Fred and Amy C. and a little bit later by King, Ned, and others. At this stage there was plenty of slipping and backsliding. But, encouraged by Mrs. Oram and Dr. Pollock, the group somehow held together. From New York we began writing letters to San Francisco, but the replies were sketchy and uncertain. At the end of a year an alky lady appeared at our New York office on Vesey Street. She was a little tight, and crying. Though of course she exaggerated a bit, she said, "Bill, we've been going a whole year in San Francisco, and do you know that at Christmas time we were all drunk?" Only a few years later, in 1951, the Lasker Award was given to Alcoholics Anonymous in the San Francisco Opera House. On the night following the award presentation there was an AA meeting and the huge place was packed. Sober alcoholics were practically hanging from the rafters. What once looked like a mighty poor acorn had produced a great oak. As early as 1941 the group had picked up steady will horses like Nya N, Ray H., and Warren T. Other starts had been made in the Bay Area, notably by Nya at Oakland and by Vic M. and Dr. P. at Sacramento. This readied the area for the impact of Jack Alexander's piece in the Saturday Evening Post. It saw Warren at work in the Kaiser shipyard, where he became the first AA member to be employed as an alcoholic specialist by industry. And perhaps even more importantly, Warren and the others were able to start the first penitentiary group at San Quentin Prison. By the time of the Lasker Award, the inspiring account of the founding of the first AA group behind the prison walls of San Quentin was a familiar story to most of our members. San Quentin's enlightened and liberal warden, Clinton T. Duffy, had, prior to 1942, given much thought to the urgent and pressing problem of prison reform, including the special needs of the inmates imprisoned for crimes committed while drinking. As Warden Duffy said, the program he now proposed would include education, vocational training, medicine, psychiatry, and religion. But the alcoholic did not seem to fit completely into this program. All the rest would not help him if the problems which drove him to drink were not solved. If every offender were to receive full advantage of the new program, then the alcoholic too must receive the assistance and understanding of all available knowledge and procedures. And in line with this new approach to rehabilitation, I looked upon Alcoholics Anonymous as a tool to help us rebuild lives. To Warden Duffy's aid came Warren and other members in the San Francisco area, and thus began the pioneering of AA's first prison group in 1942. As Warden Duffy has since said, had it not been for the regular help and understanding given by our AA friends outside, the San Quentin chapter of Alcoholics Anonymous would most assuredly have failed. And by the same token, if it had not been for the persistence of that first group of alcoholic inmates who realized their serious problem and their need for help, we could never have continued beyond the first few meetings. But even with such enthusiasm and willingness, there were formidable problems to solve. The establishment of regular AA meetings would mean carloads of AAs from the outside running in and out of prison. It would probably draw the ridicule of other prisoners. Those penologists who still thought hard-boiled methods to be the only way and those skeptics who thought AA only a useless fad would shake their heads. It would mean large gatherings of prisoners unattended by guards. The risks were great, but Warden Duffy took them, and his faith was justified. AA soon won the respect of other prisoners, and many of them, although non-alcoholic, wanted to join up anyhow. The morale of what was now a really progressive institution hit a new high. AAs came and went freely. The meetings had only one guard, stationed outside the meeting room, who was there mainly to care for the needs of the outside AA visitors at the meeting. When the parole figures on alcoholic prisoners suddenly dropped from the usual 80% return to prison to a spectacular 20% and held that way, skeptics were everywhere convinced. This piece of pioneering made AA history. More than 300 prison groups have since been established behind prison walls. We know for sure that thousands of former inmates are today making the grade on the outside. Warren, just mentioned as one of the originators of the first prison group, was also the earliest pioneer of AA in industry. At the time of the prison venture, he was employed at the nearby Kaiser shipyards to look after the alcohol problem there. Though his success was notable, it was only a starter. A few years later he and his AA wife Alice had persuaded the top management of one of America's leading railroads that something could be done in their offices and out on the lines for afflicted workers. This was perhaps the understatement of the year. Still on the job today, Warren 8 and Alice can count recoveries among their railroad friends by the hundreds, and it is surely no coincidence that this road has meanwhile achieved an unsurpassed safety record. It is certain that other carriers will one day make use of this outstanding model for the rehabilitation of their alcoholic workers. Before returning to the aftermath of the Saturday Evening Post piece, let's journey down the coast to Los Angeles. Just before the Big Book came out in 1939, we had made a pre-publication mimeographed copy of it. 400 of the books in this form were circulated among all kinds of people so that we could correct errors and get suggestions for improvement. Late in that year I made a business trip to Cleveland and handed one of these mimeographs to a friend who was an attorney. He happened to be the attorney for a wealthy young Clevelander who then lived on the coast, where he had been drinking himself into one dilemma after another. My lawyer friend sent him the pre-publication copy of the big book, and he gobbled it up. He insisted on going straight to Akron, where he placed himself under the tutelage of Dr. Bob and the benign influence of Wally G., in whose home he lived for a time. His ex-wife K.M. was not an alcoholic, but she turned up in New York, full of enthusiasm about AA for itself. She was inspired with the same spirit which is found in the family groups of today. She took a boat to the West Coast and presently landed at Los Angeles, and the next thing we knew she had looked up Johnny Howe of the city's probation department. He had plenty of drunks on his hands, both hospital inmates and parolees. Johnny had been laboring hard with his charges, but to little avail. When he was shown the book Alcoholics Anonymous and was told what Kay had seen at the twin meccas of Akron and New York, he became more hopeful and asked Kay to join forces with him, but with certain reservations. Johnny had been running instruction classes for his alcoholic customers on a strictly psychological basis. Know yourself and be free, was the idea. The AA book was a revelation to him, but it was a revelation he did not much like at first. He could not go for that surrender to the higher power business. The spiritual side of AA simply was not for Johnny. Legend has it that he and Kay compromised. Johnny would continue his lectures to inmates as before. But he and Kay would try out certain AA ideas on some of the parolees. The prospects were told that they could try Kay's ideas, or Johnny's, or both. Of course this sort of approach was not exactly orthodox AA. Nevertheless it produced some results. For example, certain well-known residents of Los Angeles and vicinity because of their drinking had fallen into the hands of the law, and thence into Johnny's hands. On parole, some of them began to take notice of the new dispensation as offered by Kay and Johnny. Hal S. was the very first. He was later to become the founder of the San Diego group. Others who came in the same way were Marshall B., Barney B., and Dr. Forrest H., the latter to become a marathon 12-stepper around Los Angeles in after years. With this much accomplished, Kay and Johnny had made a definite start in Los Angeles, and we want to record our thanks to these two non-alcoholics for all they did for us. Meanwhile, the New York office notified the Coast of the coming of Chuck, an artist, and his wife Lee, who at that time was the AA member of the family, the first alcoholic to arrive from the East. Lee was a real eager beaver. She and Chuck came to Los Angeles just in time to attend the first of the so-called home meetings. This particular gathering was held at Kay's place on Benicia Avenue on December 19, 1939. It included Kay and Johnny, Lee and Chuck, and a number of prospects. Lee agreed with Kay on stressing the spiritual aspects of the AA program, so a chapter from the AA book was read at this meeting. Johnny gave his lecture and delivered a medical paper on alcoholism. For the next few weeks meetings of this character were held in one home after another. Kay and Lee were for the higher power, and Johnny was still for psychology only. At about this time Lee secured some publicity in the Los Angeles papers which brought in more prospects and finally led to AA's friendship with Ted Luberthan, a prominent Los Angeles columnist whose subsequent articles did a far-reaching job for us. As was to be expected, this little pioneering group had many difficulties, both personal and doctrinal. Frantic letters from the several contestants poured into our one-room headquarters in New York. Finally Lee began to drink. She called upon Johnny to hospitalize her and was out in a few days. This was, however, a very heavy jolt to everyone. But the group nonetheless survived for the time being. Lee and Chuck then returned east to live happily, and both of them soberly, ever since. While all this was going on, a Denver resident named Mort J. had bought the AA book in September of 1939. Without even looking through the volume, Mort dropped it into his suitcase and set off on a spree that lasted several weeks. He finally came to himself at Palm Springs and discovered the AA book in his luggage. Shaking violently, he began to read. This was sometime in November, 1939, and he has never had a drink since. Mort was a book convert pure and simple. In March, 1940, Mort moved to Los Angeles. He looked up the Benicia Group and found that it had just about fallen apart. Erstwhile stalwarts like Hal and Dr. H. were rarely seen. Kay was downright discouraged and said she was going to Honolulu. Just as she left, she gave Mort a small list of prospects that hadn't yet been visited. That first candle at Los Angeles was flickering, but it never quite went out. Mort got busy at once on Kay's list and promptly turned up a customer named Cliff W. This one grabbed for the lifeline, and he soon sobered up for good. At his own expense, Mort hired a meeting place at Los Angeles's Cecil Hotel. Right then another book convert, Frank R., put in his appearance. A real sanitarium commuter, Frank had read the AA book in Arizona and had, at the suggestion of the New York headquarters, rushed to Los Angeles to see if what it said was really true. This founding trio soon enlarged the Cecil meeting. Mort insisted on a reading from Chapter 5 of the AA book at the start of every session. This firmly established a custom for which AA on the West Coast is now notable, and it put the Cecil group on a foursquare AA basis. The debate whether the meeting was to center around psychology or around God as we understand him was at an end. The first solid foundation for AA in Southern California was thus built. In fact, the Cecil Hotel meeting after a while became known as the Los Angeles Mother Group. From New York we tried hard to keep Los Angeles in good cheer and advice. The AA book became their mainstay, even their Bible. They were not to see a sober, experienced AA member from outside their area for a long while to come. Once they plaintively wrote us, "Well, we've got a lot of people sober out here. But we do sometimes wonder if anybody is sober east of the Rocky Mountains. We haven't seen a single Easterner who is really dry. They've all been drunk, every one of them." Led by Mort, the three elders continued to push on. And so did their wives. Mort's wife Frances backstopped the huge amount of 12-step work that Mort began to do. Frank was at times laid low by a recurring fever, and his wife Eleanor would take over his prospects and carry on his large correspondence with the New York office. When in the following year the Saturday Evening Post article appeared, Cliff had a telephone installed in his home under the AA name in order to handle the enormous demand for quick help. Cliff's wife Dorothy carried this load of work to a point of her complete exhaustion. The efforts of these six will always be well remembered in the annals of Alcoholics Anonymous. The Saturday Evening Post piece not only brought in large numbers of new members, it also added several scores of magnificent workers of all kinds and conditions. Never could Los Angeles have prospered as it did without their labors over the years to follow. It is regrettable that in the limited range of this book we cannot detail all their wonderful services. Now let us return once more to the aftermath of the Saturday Evening Post article. Lois and I visited Los Angeles sometime in 1943, and the groups called a meeting in the American Legion Hall. When I peered out from behind the curtain, I saw 1,000 people sitting there. It was incredible. Here was evidence that AA could cross the seas and mountains pretty much on its own. In the future no alcoholic messenger in the flesh might be needed at all. The rush and resulting growing pains in Los Angeles had been appalling. It seemed impossible that they could have stood the confusion and the pace. Before this first visit was over, I began to wonder if they could continue to bear up under it. Yet in 1950, only 7 years later, I spoke to an AA audience in the Shrine Auditorium, where 7,000 members and their families were gathered. By then, Los Angeles County represented the most densely populated AA region in our whole fellowship. Today it harbors 14,000 members and they are as solid as Gibraltar. On that first 1943 trip to the coast, Lois and I also looked in on Doc H., an Oregon chiropractor who was struggling with the alkies in Portland. And in Seattle, Washington, we first met businessman Dale A., who with real valor was trying hard to hold a small band together there. This he was able to do, and they went on to real success. Meanwhile, Minneapolis got underway. Chicago's Sean F. and Bill Y. were pinned down there by a 1940 blizzard, and they took time out to carry the message to an alcoholic named Pat. Pat took on the hectic job of trying to start an AA group and a club at the same time. He persuaded one of the city's flour barons to sell the AAs his former townhouse on a shoestring. Today there is no more club-minded group in all of AA than this one. The AA life of the town still gathers around that pioneering monument. And, believe it or not, those Minneapolis Alkies burned the mortgage on that clubhouse in just 3 years' time. As I remember it, Buffalo and Pittsburgh started up not much later. And right out in the middle of the country that most loved salesman, Johnny P., had put in an appearance to plant AA in Kansas City, Missouri. This touched off another group right across the river in Kansas City, Kansas. It was sparked by one of AA's first doctor members, Miles N., who was later to become a prodigious AA worker and a national authority on the chemistry of drunks. In these same years, the Boston Irish had joined forces with certain Back Bayers and had grabbed the AA lifeline with a will, forming that wonderful nucleus from which so much of AA in New England later stemmed. The Boston group provided us with a fresh wonder and a big heartbreak, too. Its founder could never get sober himself and he finally died of alcoholism. Paddy was just too sick to make it. Slip followed slip, but he came back each time to carry AA's message, at which he was amazingly successful. Time after time the group nursed him back to life. Then came the last bender, and that was it. This very sick man left behind him a great group and a AAA rating for valor. His first 2 successes, Bert C. and Jenny B., carry on to this day. Such was our adolescence. I hope that someday many more of its wonderful stories can be told. This was the welter of exciting and fearsome experience out of which AA's 12 traditions were drawn and first put to paper in 1946. Against this background we shall now consider those 12 traditions, the vital principles upon which the survival of Alcoholics Anonymous so heavily depends. Implicit throughout AA's traditions is the confession that our fellowship has its sins. We confess that we have character defects as a society and that these defects threaten us continually. Our traditions are a guide to better ways of working and living, and they are also an antidote for our various maladies. The 12 traditions are to group survival and harmony what AA's 12 steps are to each member's sobriety and peace of mind. But the 12 traditions also point straight at many of our individual defects. By implication they ask each of us to lay aside pride and resentment. They ask for personal as well as group sacrifice. They ask us never to use the AA name in any quest for personal power or distinction or money. The traditions guarantee the equality of all members and the independence of all groups. They show how we may best relate ourselves to each other and to the world outside. They indicate how we can best function in harmony as a great whole. For the sake of the welfare of our entire society, the traditions ask that every individual and every group and every area in AA shall lay aside all desires, ambitions, and untoward actions that could bring serious division among us or lose for us the confidence of the world at large. The 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous symbolize the sacrificial character of our life together and they are the greatest force for unity that we know. Take Tradition 1. It says that, our common welfare should come first. Personal recovery depends upon AA unity. Probably no society sets a higher value on the personal welfare of the individual member than does AA. But long ago we found that the common welfare had to come first, without it there could be mighty little personal welfare. In the beginning we felt very much like Eddie Rickenbacker and his company when their plane crashed in the Pacific. They had been saved from death but found themselves still floating upon a dangerous sea. There was no doubt in their minds that the common welfare came first. Nobody dared rock that raft, lest they all perish. Bread and water were shared equally, there were no gluttons. Our case was something like that. But some of our sick and careless members did rock the raft, and that scared us to death. Some of those early fears are today almost amusing. The first big one was that of slips or relapses. At first nearly every alcoholic we approached began to slip, if indeed he sobered up at all. Others would stay dry 6 months or maybe a year and then take a skid. This was always a genuine catastrophe. We would all look at each other and say, "Who next?" We were afraid that alcohol might completely undo us. But today we see tens of thousands of members completely sober for 5, 10, 15, or even 20 years. Slips are a very serious difficulty, but as a group we take them in stride. Fear has evaporated. Alcohol always threatens the individual, but we know that it cannot destroy the common welfare. The next big scare was the out-of-bounds romance, the well-known triangle. In the cases of more than half of our membership, the family relation had been distorted. Drinking had turned the husband into the household's bad boy and the wife into his protective and possessive mother. When this relation persisted after AA, the husband sometimes got the wandering eye. Alcoholic women whose husbands had long since cast them off put in an appearance. Here and there we began to witness explosions gathering around these situations. People violently took sides. Whole groups got into uproars, and a number of people got drunk. There was some throwing of rocks at the sinners. We trembled for AA's reputation and for its survival. But at last we woke up to the fact that we were not having any more sex difficulties than other societies, and possibly less. We found that these situations would often right themselves if they were treated with patience and kindness. The sinners and the self-righteous eventually saw the folly of their ways. Most alcoholics whose wives had seen them through their terrible days returned to the straight and narrow. The Al-Anon family groups put in an appearance and did wonders for AA's domestic relations. So these experiences all conspired toward a good end. AA's present divorce rate is among the lowest in the whole world. It became apparent that the relationship between the sexes was not going to do us in after all, and our fears in this area subsided. But like other societies, we soon found that there were forces among us that could threaten us in ways that alcohol and sex could not. These were the desires for power, for domination, for glory, and for money. They were all the more dangerous because they were invariably powered by self-righteousness, self-justification, and the destructive power of anger, usually masquerading as righteous indignation. Pride and fear and anger, these are the prime enemies of our common welfare. True brotherhood, harmony, and love, fortified by clear insights and right practices, are the only answers. And the purpose of AA's traditional principles is to bring these forces to the top and keep them there. Only then can our common welfare be served, only then can AA's unity become permanent. Now let us think about tradition too. For our group purpose there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. Our leaders are but trusted servants. They do not govern. We AAs have learned this principle the hard way. Few obstacles have been tougher to remove than those which blocked the way to realization that AA's group conscience can be the only ultimate authority in our affairs. I expect that many an old-timer still does not believe this proposition. He feels that he is older and more experienced than recent generations of AAs and that it was his guidance and leadership that brought them into the new life. We oldsters often construed our longer experience as a sort of vested right, even an unlimited license, to run AA indefinitely. Whenever we got sick, tired, or old, we naturally thought ourselves entitled to handpick our own successors. Who could know better than we? But with the passage of time most of us came up against some hard facts of AA life. We ruefully discovered that the groups, no matter how much they liked and respected us, simply did not want us to be the self-appointed managers of their service and policy affairs forever. Neither would they let us pick our own successors to do the job for them. They wanted to name their own service committees. Again and again they showed us that the ultimate authority must speak through the groups. For some of us this was tough to take. Harder still to accept was the now proven fact that the conscience of the group, when properly informed of the facts and issues and principles involved, was often wiser than any leader, self-appointed or not. We slowly realized that the old-timer frequently was faulty in judgment. Because of his position of assumed authority, he was too often influenced by personal prejudices and interests. With all his experience and good works, there was still nothing infallible about him at all. Does this mean that as old-timers our usefulness is over? No. Once we old-timers have surrendered to the group conscience, we are pleasantly surprised to find that the groups, when in deep difficulty, will again turn to us for the kind of guidance that only our longer experience can give. I well remember when I had to swallow my first dose of this hard but healthy doctrine. In 1937 the financial going was rough at 182 Clinton Street. Several alkies were living with us, most of them paying no board. Lois was still in the department store and her pay was just about all the money we had. Meanwhile, many of the sober members coming to our weekly meetings were back on their feet and earning good money. One day at Charlie Town's hospital, Charlie beckoned me into his office for one of his Dutch uncle talks. "Look here, Bill," said he, "I've got a hunch that this AA business of yours is someday going to fill Madison Square Garden. Now I am not a religious man and you must know that I was mighty skeptical of this business when it first came in here. Silkworth really scared me by his cooperation with you. But that is all changed. I believe in you people. Your methods are going to work." And he said, "Look, Bill, don't you see you're getting the bad end of this deal? You are starving to death, and your wife is working at that store. All around you, these drunks are getting well and making money, but you're giving this work full time, and still you're broke. It isn't fair." Charlie fished in his desk and came up with an old financial statement. Handing it to me, he continued, "This shows the kind of money this hospital used to make back in the 1930s. Thousands of dollars a month. It should be doing just as well now, and it would if only you'd help it. So why don't you move your work in here? I'll give you an office, a decent drawing account, and a very healthy slice of the profits. What I propose is perfectly ethical. You can become a lay therapist, and more successful than anybody in the business." I was bowled over. There were a few twinges of conscience until I saw how really ethical Charlie's proposal was. There was nothing wrong whatever with becoming a lay therapist. I thought of Lois coming home exhausted from the department store each day, only to cook a supper for a house full of drunks who were not paying board. I thought of the large sum of money I still owed my Wall Street creditors. I thought of some of my alcoholic friends who were making as much money as they ever did. Why shouldn't I do as well as they? Although I asked Charlie for a little time to consider it, my own mind was about made up. Going back to Brooklyn on the subway, I had a flash of seeming divine guidance. It was only a single sentence, but it was most convincing. In fact, it came right out of the Bible. A voice kept saying to me, "The laborer is worthy of his hire." At home I found Lois cooking as usual, while three drunks looked hungrily on from the kitchen door. I drew her aside and told her the glorious news. She looked interested, but not as excited as I thought she should be. It was meeting night. Although few of the alcoholics we boarded seemed to get sober, some others had. With their wives, they crowded into our downstairs parlor. At once I burst into the story of my opportunity. I never shall forget their impassive faces and the steady gazes they focused on me. With waning enthusiasm, my story trailed off to the end. There was a long silence. Almost timidly, one of my friends began to speak. "We know how hard up you are, Bill," he said. "It bothers us a lot. We've often wondered what we might do about it. But I think I speak for everyone here when I say that what you now propose bothers us an awful lot more." The speaker's voice grew more confident. "Don't you realize," he went on, "that you can never become a professional? As generous as Charlie has been to us, don't you see that we can't tie this thing up with his hospital or any other? You tell us that Charlie's proposal is ethical. Sure, it's ethical. But what we've got won't run on ethics only, it has to be better. Sure, Charlie's idea is good, but it isn't good enough. This is a matter of life and death, Bill, and nothing but the very best will do." My friends looked at me challengingly as their spokesman continued. "Bill, haven't you often said right here in this meeting that sometimes the good is the enemy of the best? Well, this is a plain case of it. You can't do this thing to us. Thus spoke the group conscience. The group was right and I was wrong. The voice on the subway was not the voice of God. Here was the true voice welling up out of my friends. I listened and thank God I obeyed. 3 blows, well and truly struck, had fallen on the anvil of group experience. They rang in my consciousness. The common welfare must come first. AA cannot have a class of professional therapists, and God, speaking in the group conscience, is to be our final authority. Clearly implied in these 3 embryo principles of tradition was a 4th, our leaders are but trusted servants, they do not govern. Tradition 3 for a long time was a puzzler. 2, the only requirement for AA membership is a sincere desire to stop drinking. We worried a lot about membership. In fact, when heavy publicity first came our way, we were scared witless. We said to ourselves, won't all kinds of odd people show up? Complications, you know, alcohol mixed with other things. In those days we were always talking about the mythical character called the pure alcoholic, no complications, you understand, just a guzzler. We actually thought we were like that ourselves. Hence, when members began pouring in, our worry mounted. Won't there be mighty queer people? Won't there be criminals? Won't there be social undesirables? We asked. Mixed with a certain amount of snobbishness and smugness, this was downright fear. We simply did not know what or who would turn up. Since that early time literally all kinds of people have found their way into Alcoholics Anonymous. Our inclusiveness is now very broad indeed. For example, not too long ago I sat talking in my office with a member who bears a title of Countess. That same night I went to an AA meeting. It was a winter night and there was a mild-looking little gent taking the coats. He was not charging anything, either. He was just doing it to be obliging. I said, "Who's that little guy?" And somebody answered, "Oh, he's been around for a long time. Everybody likes him. He used to be one of Al Capone's mob." That's how universal AA is today. But it took us a long, long time to become really democratic. There used to be so many membership rules out among the groups that if they were all enforced at once nobody could have joined Alcoholics Anonymous. But as our fears subsided we finally said to ourselves, who are we to keep anybody out? To many a desperate drunk AA is the court of his last appeal. How can we slam the door on anybody who stands outside? No, we must never do that. We must always take the risk, no matter who comes in. Maybe our public relations will be damaged because a few strange characters are among us. Of course our public relations are important, but is not the real character of this society still more important? Who of us dares to say, "No, you can't come in," thereby setting himself up as judge, jury, and perhaps executioner of his brother alcoholic? So the experience through the years, now distilled into Tradition 3, says, you are an AA member if you say so. No matter what you have done, or still will do, you are an AA member as long as you say so. Now here comes Tradition 4. It declares that each group should be autonomous, except in matters affecting other groups or AA as a whole. As one of the people who helped start this movement, I thought for a long time that I ought to be able to manage it from New York. But I soon found that I could do no such thing. Neither could anybody else at AA's headquarters. The group said to us, "We like what you are doing. Sometimes your suggestions and advice are good. But whether to take you or leave you alone is going to be our decision. Out in the groups, we are going to run our own show. We are not going to have a personal government in New York or anywhere else. Services, yes. But government, no." Hence, AA's tradition of group autonomy. It didn't take long to formulate that one. They told us just what they wanted, and that included the right to be wrong. To illustrate, years ago in a certain town a super promoter got sobered up in AA. At once he got very big ideas, all for the good of AA of course. As he saw it, the right setup would require a very big building and would take an awful lot of money. On one floor there would be a club. On the next floor there would be a meeting room. On the next, a clinic and rehabilitation center. Upstairs, there surely would have to be a loan agency where the indigent alcoholic could borrow a little spare cash. Such was his vision of the new center. He was some promoter, this one, and he actually sold the townspeople on his idea. He, naturally, was to become the general manager. His blueprint involved 3 separate corporations, one for the club, one for the clinic, and one for the loan department. Altogether, he wrote 61 rules, regulations, and bylaws to make these corporations do their good work. With the exception of a few diehards, his fellow AAs were sold. He was the man of the hour. He applied to New York for a super charter. Hearing of this, some of the dissenters wrote us. We had to tell them that each AA group could manage its own affairs as it liked, provided it did not harm surrounding groups. But as strongly as we dared, we did point out that even less grandiose schemes of a like character had failed everywhere before. As it had a right to, this very autonomous group ignored our warnings. Maybe you can guess what happened. After many a rumbling, the crash came. It was like a boiler explosion in a clapboard factory. The thump of colliding egos could be heard and felt for miles. But of course things quieted down, and after a long interval we heard from the promoter. He wrote, "You told us that outside enterprises can be fine and very helpful. But you also said that they could not be mixed with AA. I figured that they could be, and should be. Well, you folks at headquarters were right and I was wrong." With his letter, the promoter sent us a card, which he had already mailed to every group in the United States. It was folded like a golf score card, and on the outside was printed, Group so-and-so, Place so-and-so. Rule number 62. When the card was unfolded, a single pungent sentence met the eye: "Don't take yourself too damned seriously." Thus, under Tradition 4, an AA group had exercised its right to be wrong. Moreover, it had performed a great service for Alcoholics Anonymous, because it had been humbly willing to apply the lessons it had learned. It had picked itself up with a laugh and had gone on to better things. Even the chief architect, standing in the ruins of his dream, could laugh at himself, and that is the acme of humility. Some may think that we have carried the principle of group autonomy to extremes. For example, in its original, long form, Tradition 4 declares, "Any 2 or 3 gathered together for sobriety may call themselves an AA group, provided that as a group they have no other affiliation." This means that these 2 or 3 alcoholics could try for sobriety in any way they liked. They could disagree with any or all of AA's principles and still call themselves an AA group. But this ultra-liberty is not so risky as it looks. In the end, the innovators would have to adopt AA principles, at least some of them, in order to remain sober at all. If, on the other hand, they found something better than AA, or if they were able to improve on our methods, then in all probability we would adopt what they discovered for general use everywhere. This sort of liberty also prevents AA from becoming a frozen set of dogmatic principles that could not be changed even when obviously wrong. Healthy trial and error always have their day and place in AA. Of course, any dissident group is urged, though never commanded, not to make any other affiliation. Obviously we could not very well have Catholic AA groups, Protestant AA groups, Republican AA groups, Democratic AA groups, or Communist AA groups. Nor should an AA group ally itself with any particular brand of medical or psychiatric treatment. We can cooperate with anyone. But the name Alcoholics Anonymous must be reserved for us only. Many people wonder how AA can function under such a seeming anarchy. Other societies have to have law and force and sanction and punishment, administered by authorized people. Happily for us, we found we need no human authority whatever. We have 2 authorities which are far more effective. One is benign, the other malign. There is God, our Father, who very simply says, "I am waiting for you to do my will." The other authority is named John Barleycorn, and he says, "You had better do God's will or I will kill you." And sometimes he does kill. So, when all the chips are down, we conform to God's will or perish. At this level, the death sentence hangs over the AA member, his group, and AA as a whole. Therefore we have the full benefits of the murderous political dictatorships of today but none of their liabilities. So there is authority enough, love enough, and punishment enough, all without any human being clutching the handles of power. Such is AA's backstop against dissolution, and its final guarantee of survival under any conditions. For us, it is do or die. But this is not the whole story. As our individual and group development progresses, we begin to obey the AA traditions for other reasons. We begin to obey them because we think they are right for us. We obey these principles because we think they are good principles, even though we still resist somewhat. Then comes the final level of obedience, the best of all. We obey AA's steps and traditions because we really want them for ourselves. It is no longer a question of good or evil. We conform because we genuinely want to conform. Such is our process of growth in unity and in function. Such is the evidence of God's grace and love among us. Much of our discussion so far leads straight to Tradition 5, which states, each group has but one primary purpose, to carry its message to the alcoholic who still suffers. We think we should do one thing well rather than many things to which we are not called. That is the central idea of this tradition. Our society gathers in unity around this concept. The very life of our fellowship requires its preservation. Shoemaker, stick to thy last, is no dull cliché for Alcoholics Anonymous. Together we have found a substantial remedy for a terrible malady. Of course we might interest ourselves in fields of education, research, neurosis, and the like. But, as a society, should we? Our experience says that we definitely should not. We can and we do help, as individuals, in those fields. That is good. But, as a fellowship, we know that we must not be diverted. It is our experience as alcoholics that makes us of unique value on our sector of the total alcoholic front. We can approach sufferers as no one else can. Therefore, the strongest kind of moral and ethical compulsion is upon us to do this and nothing more. If we had discovered a widely applicable cancer cure, we would be begged to attend to that and that only. We would not try to look after all tumors and branch out into tuberculosis and tapeworms besides. In such a case we would certainly stick to cancer. Though AA is obligated to both medicine and religion, we cannot become experts in either. We know that theology is for clergymen and that the practice of medicine and psychiatry is for doctors. Certain that we can do together what we cannot do separately, we shall always cooperate but never compete. We shall direct our energies where they count most. Most emphatically, then, AA has but one single purpose, to carry its message to the alcoholic who still suffers. That is our basic objective, our real reason for existence. A logical outgrowth of Tradition 5, Tradition 6 reads, an AA group ought never endorse, finance, or lend the AA name to any related facility or outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary purpose. In the old days our foundation, now the General Service Board, was originally chartered to do everything but lobby for prohibition. We were chartered for education, we were chartered for research, we could do almost anything. And we used to think we wanted a lot of money to do a lot of things. Out in the groups the same ideas often prevailed. At that time hospitals did not want us, so we thought we would build and operate our own. People needed to be told what alcoholism was, so we thought we would educate the public. Perhaps rewrite school and medical textbooks. We thought we would revise the laws of the land and have it declared that alcoholics are sick people. We would carry AA into the dark regions of dope addiction and criminality. We would form groups for depressive and paranoid folks, and the deeper the neurosis the better we would like it. If alcoholism could be licked, so could any problem. AA's uncompromising honesty might soon clean up politics. In the factories it could cause laborers and capitalists to love each other. Having learned to live so happily, we would show everybody else how. We thought our Society of Alcoholics Anonymous might prove to be the spearhead of a new spiritual advance. Our principles might transform the world. Yes, we did dream those dreams. How natural that was, since most alcoholics are bankrupt idealists. Nearly every one of us had wished to do great good, perform great deeds that embodied great ideals. We were perfectionists who, failing to attain perfection, had gone to the other extreme and settled for the bottle and the blackout. Providence through AA had brought us within reach of our highest expectations. So why shouldn't we share our way of life with everyone? Well, we tried AA hospitals. And they all bogged down because you cannot put an AA group into business. Too many busybody cooks always spoil the broth. AA groups had their fling at education, and when they began publicly to whoop up the merits of this or that brand of education, people became confused. Did AA fix alcoholics, or was it an educational project? Was AA spiritual or was it medical? Was it a reform movement? In consternation, we saw ourselves getting married to all kinds of enterprises, some good and some not so good. When we saw alcoholics committed willy-nilly to prisons and asylums, we began to say, there ought to be a law. In full public view, some AAs commenced to thump tables in legislative committee rooms and to agitate for legal reform. That made good newspaper copy but little else. We saw that we would soon be mired in politics. We found it imperative even inside AA to remove the AA name from clubs and 12-step houses. These strenuous adventures implanted the deep-rooted conviction that in no circumstances could we endorse any related enterprise, no matter how good. We of Alcoholics Anonymous could not be all things to all men, and we should not try to be. The moment we lent the AA name to any outside enterprise, we got into trouble, sometimes very serious trouble. At one time we nearly got embroiled in the wet-dry controversy. A liquor trade association wanted to hire an AA member as an educator. Its members wanted to teach that too much grog is bad for everybody and that alcoholics cannot drink at all. So far, so good. But it further appeared that in all their publicity, they wished to stress the fact that their educator, Mr. X, was a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. That was something else again. The public would at once think that Alcoholics Anonymous had gone into the field of education, via the liquor industry. If that happened, the Dries would instantly hire another AA member for educational purposes. This would land us, of course, smack in the middle of endless controversy. We simply could not take sides in this fight and do business with sick alcoholics too. The would-be educator showed up at the New York office, asking for advice. Of course we told him that we thought factual education to be a very good thing and that as a public relations expert and as a citizen he certainly had a perfect right to take the job. But did he think that he should advertise his AA membership at the same time? Our member got the point. He said, "Alcoholics Anonymous saved my life. It comes first. I certainly won't be the guy to land AA in big-time trouble, and this might really do it." Our friend had summed up the whole endorsement problem. We saw as never before that we could not lend the AA name to any cause other than our own. Long afterward we saw something else. We saw that the more AA minded its own business, the greater its general influence would become. Medicine and religion and psychiatry began to borrow some of our ideas and experience. So did research, rehabilitation, and education. All sorts of therapeutic groups began to spring up. They dealt with gambling, divorce, delinquency, dope addiction, mental illness, and the like. They, too, borrowed from AA, but they made their own adaptations. They worked their own fields, and we did not have to endorse them or tell them how to live. Our influence has not been confined just to these fields. It is beginning now to be general. It crops out in political and business life. People who know alcoholics and their families are deeply affected. The very developments that we once wanted to force have begun to take place of themselves. Today we understand and accept this paradox. the more AA sticks to its primary purpose, the greater will be its helpful influence everywhere. Let us now talk about money and AA's attitude toward it. Wealth had ruined many men and nations. So would it ruin us? Especially in America, money was the symbol of prestige and power and comfort. Money can do a lot of good, yet there is practically no evil which it cannot arouse. Would AA's brand of spirituality mix with any money at all? Or, on the other hand, should we have a lot of money, the better to do good works? This was the age-old dilemma and the temptation that faced us. The conservatives said, why tempt ourselves with money? We don't need it. We can meet in homes and no group will have to have a treasury. Why do we need books and offices and world services? One alcoholic carries the message to another. Let's keep it that simple and stay out of money trouble. The radicals thought otherwise. Not only do we need essential services, we need plenty more. We need hospitals, paid therapists, traveling lecturers, rehabilitation centers, and heaven knows what else. It is going to take millions. And where will we get all this money? Well, we will get it from the public, just as most other good works do. After a while we awoke to the pleasant fact that AA as such was not going to require much money after all. When we got rid of our grandiose ideas about hospitals, research, rehabilitation, and education, not much of a bill was left to pay. Other enterprises needed large sums, but we did not. We could be spared that headache. A big factor in our thinking at the time was the philosophy of Saint Francis of Assisi. His also began as a lay movement, one man carrying the good news to the next. In his day it was common enough for individuals to pledge themselves to poverty. But it was unusual, if not unique, for a whole organization or fellowship to do the same thing. For the purpose of his society Francis thought corporate poverty to be fundamental. The less money and property they had to quarrel about, the less would be the diversion from their primary purpose. And just like AA today, his outfit did not need much money to accomplish its mission. Why be tempted and diverted when there was no need for it? Therefore AA adopted the wisdom of Francis as its own. Not only would we have the least possible service organization, we would use the least possible money. For us this does not mean no money at all. But it does mean the least possible money to do the job well. It is in this sense that AA has declared for the principle of corporate poverty. It is a chief safeguard of our future. Despite our early tradition of keeping AA poor for its own safety, we were still to have temptations. There were 3 of them. The first came when we met with Mr. John D. Rockefeller, Jr., and his friends in the fall of 1937. At that time the possibility of unlimited financial backing pretty much dimmed our sharing of the vision of St. Francis. Dr. Bob and I, and indeed most of us, were awfully broke. Ideas of comfortable and well-paid jobs, chains of AA hospitals, and tons of free literature for suffering alkies seized our imagination. But Mr. Rockefeller had other ideas. He said, "I think money will spoil this." He acted accordingly, and AA stayed poor. St. Francis had given us the idea, but John D. wisely forced us to live up to it. This was the oddly assorted pair who were really responsible for AA's tradition on money. Thank God for them both. The second temptation veered to the other extreme. We got so scared of money that we went tightwad, half refusing to support AA's simple but essential area and overall services, without which we would fail to function and grow. Even now we haven't quite surmounted this one. We still drag our heels when the hat is passed to support local intergroup offices and general headquarters. And this holding back is not for lack of folding money either. The collective income of AA's membership, the sum of our wages, salaries, and other emoluments, will presently reach a total of $1 billion yearly. When sober and working, few alcoholics have any money trouble. Our earning power as individuals may actually be double the average. The material payoff, as well as the spiritual payoff, of AA's way of life is downright incredible. Nevertheless, we still balk a bit when it comes to paying AA's very reasonable service bills. Sometimes I think this may be all to the good. There is not the slightest danger that AA is ever going to get too rich from the voluntary contributions of its own members. There is a funny but revealing story about this. And the joke is on me. It was in 1941, just after the Saturday Evening Post story broke. The income from the AA book would not pay for answering the thousands of inquiries, and we had set up $1 a year per member as the measuring stick for voluntary contributions that might meet the bill. It was the first time AA headquarters had asked groups for any help. At the time, Lois and I were receiving $30 a week as the result of Mr. Rockefeller's dinner. We were living in a little room in the 24th Street Club. Our household furniture was still in storage and we were mighty hard up. One morning a bleary-eyed friend just off a bender stuck his head into the little VC Street office. I was pacing up and down, cussing out the drunks for being so slow in sending in their buck apiece. I was in a really mean mood, so I gave my bleary-eyed friend a big gripe on how stingy drunks were. Naturally, he agreed. Just to make myself generous, I pulled out a $5 bill and handed it to him. It was money that Lois needed for the groceries, and I knew very well that he would go out and drink it up. But this grandiose act made me feel good. Poor I, could give $5 when those guys out there couldn't even send in $1. Distinctly satisfied with myself, I went to the meeting that night in the club. The club was behind with its rent. In those days, you could not mix the material with the spiritual at all. Money was a subject you could hardly mention, but the landlord was not getting his rent, so it had to be mentioned. At intermission, my old friend Tom B., who led the meeting that night, timidly said, "Now, folks, can't you go a little heavy on the hat tonight? We're kind of behind with the rent." Such was his apologetic announcement. I was sitting on the stairs with some new convert. Nevertheless, I heard him and I knew the club was behind. Finally the hat came up the stairs where we were, and I reached in my pocket and got a coin. When I fished it out, it was $50. Scarcely thinking, I dropped that $50 back into my pocket and produced a dime that clinked thinly in the hat. A minute later I woke up. I who had boasted of my generosity that morning was treating my own club worse than the alcoholics who had forgotten to send the foundation their dollars. I realized that my $5 gift to the backslider was an ego-feeding act, bad for him and bad for me. There was a place in AA where spirituality and money would mix, and that was in the hat. I never since have criticized anybody for failing to send $1 or so to headquarters. Our third money temptation was the greatest peril of all three. One night the trustees of our foundation were having their quarterly meeting. The agenda included a crucial question. A certain lady had died, and when her will was read, it was discovered that she had left to Alcoholics Anonymous, in trust with the foundation, a sum of $10,000. The question was, should AA take the gift? What a debate we had on that one. The foundation was really hard up just then. The groups were not sending in enough money for the support of the office, we had been tossing in all the book income, and even that had not been enough, the reserve fund was melting like snow in springtime. We badly needed that $10,000. Maybe, some said, the groups will never fully support the office. We can't let it shut down, it is far too vital. Yes, let's take the money. Let's take all such donations in the future. We're going to need them. Then came the opposition. They pointed out that the foundation board already knew of a total of $500,000 set aside for AA in the wills of people still alive. Heaven only knew how much we had not heard about. If outside donations were not declined, not absolutely cut off, the foundation would one day become rich. Moreover, at the slightest intimation to the general public from our trustees that we needed money, we could become immensely rich. Compared to this prospect, the $10,000 under consideration was not much, but like the alcoholic's first drink, it would, if taken, inevitably set up a disastrous chain reaction. Where would that land us? Whoever pays the piper is apt to call the tune, and if the AA Foundation obtained money from outside sources, its trustees might be tempted to run things without reference to the wishes of AA as a whole. Every alcoholic, feeling relieved of responsibility, would shrug and say, "Oh, the foundation is wealthy. Why should I bother?" The pressure of that fat treasury would surely tempt the board to invent all kinds of schemes to do good with such funds, and so divert AA from its primary purpose. The moment that happened, our fellowship's confidence would be shaken. The board might be isolated and might fall under heavy attack and criticism from both AA and the public. These were the possibilities pro and con. Then our trustees wrote a bright page of AA history. They declared for the principle that AA must always stay poor. Reasonable running expenses plus a prudent reserve would henceforth be the foundation's financial policy. Regardless of current needs, the trustees officially declined that $10,000 and adopted a formal, airtight resolution that all such future gifts would be similarly declined. At that moment, the principle of corporate poverty was firmly and finally embedded in AA tradition. When the newspapers got hold of these facts, there was a profound reaction. To people familiar with endless drives for charitable funds, AA presented a strange and refreshing spectacle. Approving editorials here and abroad generated a great new wave of confidence in the integrity of Alcoholics Anonymous. They pointed out that the irresponsible had become responsible, and that by making financial independence part of its tradition, Alcoholics Anonymous had revived an ideal that this era had almost forgotten. This is why AA's Tradition 7 now reads, "Every AA group ought to be fully self-supporting, declining outside contributions." Tradition 8 says that Alcoholics Anonymous should remain forever non-professional, but our service centers may employ special workers. Alcoholics Anonymous will never have a professional therapeutic class. We have gained some understanding of the ancient words, "Freely you have received, freely give." For our purpose, we have discovered that at the point of professionalism money and spirituality do not mix. We do not decry professionalism in other fields, but we accept the sober fact that it does not work for us. Every time we have tried to professionalize our 12th step, the result has been exactly the same, our single purpose has been defeated. You remember how I was told by AA's group conscience that I could not go to work for Charlie Towns as a professional therapist, and that was right. Early in the game we discovered that under no conditions should an AA be paid for taking or carrying this message to somebody else, person to person and face to face. That was out. If professionalism ever invaded us at that level, we were doomed. But the issue of professionalism had other aspects. For years we were trying to figure out what in AA was professionalism and what was not. This problem arose out of the need for paid workers in our service centers, the need for people who would do the jobs that volunteers could not or would not do. Were service workers professionals, or were they not? That was the issue. The first situation of this kind that I can remember came up in the old clubhouse on 24th Street in New York. Volunteers had painted the place and shined it up and were answering the telephone, and that was fine. When they went home they would hand out numerous keys for the benefit of the night owls. But some of the owls had a habit of getting stewed and lying around the place in all conditions and at all hours. That was not good. The volunteers also got very tired of sweeping out the place, so it stayed dirty most of the time. Plainly enough we needed a caretaker. Well, we approached old Tom, a fireman we had recently sprung out of Rockland Asylum. We were shrewd. We already knew that Tom had a pension as a fireman. So we said to him, "How would you like to come over, Tom, and live at the club? Nice room for you there." Tom said, "What's the angle?" "Well, Tom, we'll give you a nice room and you can kind of look after the place." Tom said, 7 days a week? Yeah. What am I supposed to do? Well, Tom, you ought to make the coffee and, lead the drunks out if they're too bad, and sweep the place up. Do that 7 days a week, said Tom. What you guys want is a janitor. All right, we said, sure, we want a janitor. Well, said Tom, ain't you going to pay me nothing? Oh, no, we said, that would make you a professional. This is Alcoholics Anonymous. We must not mix money with spirituality. Okay, said Tom, no money, no work. I'm doing my 12th step work free, but if you're going to have me here as a janitor, you're going to pay me, see? Lots of us were working at that time and earning money. But believe it or not, we actually haggled with that old man to get him down to the last cent we could for doing that grubby job. But old Tom was right. In order for AA to function, we had to hire some help. In all the length and breadth of AA, among the whole 200,000 or more of us, we have today only 200 or 300 hired help all around. That includes cooks frying hamburgers in clubs, janitors sweeping out the places, and women answering telephones in our central offices. It also includes me. I once wrote some literature for you, so I am paid a royalty for being a writer. That is where the line finally fell, for face-to-face treatment of a drunk, no money, ever. But AA does have to hire people so that it can function where there are legitimate jobs to be done. Even after AA's Tradition 8 was thus established in principle, it took still more years to work out the applications. There were all sorts of borderline cases, always in hot debate. For example, no AAs have been more buffeted by such emotional gusts than those bold enough to accept employment with outside agencies dealing with the alcohol problem. A university wanted an AA member to educate the public on alcoholism. A corporation wanted a personnel man familiar with the subject. A state drunk farm wanted a manager who could really handle inebriates. A city wanted an experienced social worker who understood what alcohol could do to a family. A state alcohol commission wanted a paid researcher. These are only a few of the jobs which AA members as individuals are filling today. Now and then AA members have bought farms or rest homes where badly beat-up tapers could find needed care. The question was, are such activities to be branded as professionalism under AA tradition? Our years of experience tell us that the answer is, no. Members who select such full-time careers do not professionalize AA's 12th step. The road to this conclusion was long and rocky. At first, we could not see the real issue involved. In former days, the moment an AA hired out to such enterprises, he was immediately tempted to use the name Alcoholics Anonymous for publicity or money-raising purposes. Drunk farms, educational ventures, state legislatures and commissions advertised the fact that AA members served them. Unthinkingly, AAs who were so employed recklessly broke their anonymity to thump the tub for their pet enterprises. For this reason, some very good causes and everything connected with them suffered unjust criticism from AA groups. There were cries of professionalism. That guy is making money out of AA. Yet not a single one of them had been hired to do AA's 12th step work. The violation in these instances was not professionalism at all, it was breaking anonymity. AA's sole purpose was being compromised and the name of Alcoholics Anonymous was being misused. It is significant now that almost no AA in our fellowship breaks anonymity at the general public level, and so nearly all of these fears have subsided. We see that we have no right or need to discourage AAs who wish to work as individuals in these wider fields. It would be actually antisocial were we to discourage them. We cannot declare AA such a closed corporation that we keep our knowledge and experience top secret. If an AA member, acting as a citizen, can become a better researcher, educator, or personnel officer, why not? Everybody gains, and we have lost nothing. True, some of the projects to which AAs have attached themselves have been ill-conceived, but that makes not the slightest difference in the principle involved. This is the exciting chain of events that finally cast up AA's tradition of non-professionalism. Our 12th step, carrying the message, is never to be paid for, but those who labor in service for us are worthy of their hire. Tradition 9 states, AA, as such, ought never to be organized, but we may create service boards or committees directly responsible to those they serve. This one still puzzles a lot of people. How can you have a society that is unorganized, and at the same time organize services? Yet AA does it. When Tradition 9 was first written it said, Alcoholics Anonymous needs the least possible organization. In the years since then, we have changed our minds about that. Today we are able to say with assurance that Alcoholics Anonymous, AA as a whole, should never be organized at all. Then, in seeming contradiction, we proceed to create special boards and committees which in themselves are organized. How can we have an unorganized movement which can and does create a service organization for itself? Scanning this puzzler, people say, what do they mean, no organization? What we really mean, of course, is that AA can never have an organized direction or government. To amplify this, did anyone ever hear of a nation, a church, a political party, even a benevolent association that had no membership rules? Did anyone ever hear of a society that could not somehow discipline its members and enforce obedience to necessary rules and regulations? Does not nearly every society on earth give authority to some of its members to impose obedience upon the rest and to punish or expel offenders? Therefore, every nation, in fact every form of society, has to be a government administered by human beings. Power to direct and govern is the essence of organization everywhere. To this rule Alcoholics Anonymous is a complete exception. It does not at any point conform to the pattern of a government. Neither its General Service Conference, its General Service Board, nor the humblest group committee can issue a single directive to an AA member and make it stick, let alone hand out any punishment. We have tried it lots of times, but failure is always the result. Groups have tried to expel members, but the banished have come back to sit in the meeting place, saying, "This is life for us, you can't keep us out." Committees have instructed many an AA to stop working on a chronic backslider, only to be told, "How I do my 12th step work is my business. Who are you to judge?" An AA may take advice or suggestions from more experienced members, but he surely will not take orders. Who is less popular than the old-time AA, full of wisdom, who moves to another area and tries to tell the group there how to run its business? He and all like him who view with alarm for the good of AA, meet with stubborn resistance, or worse still, laughter. In fact, AA is so unorganized that someone once suggested we put up a sign in each AA club saying, "Anything goes here, folks, except you mustn't smoke opium in the elevators." One would think that AA's headquarters and General Service Conference would be exceptions. Surely the people there would have to have some authority. But long ago trustees and staff members alike found they could do no more than make suggestions, and very mild ones at that. They even had to coin a couple of sentences which still go into half the letters they write. "Of course you are at perfect liberty to handle this matter any way you please." But the majority experience in AA does seem to suggest, now, that attitude is far removed from central government, isn't it? We recognize that we cannot dictate to fellow members, individually or collectively. At this juncture we can hear a churchman exclaim, "They are making disobedience a virtue." He is joined by the psychiatrist who says, "Defiant brats. They won't grow up and conform to social usage." The man in the street says, "I don't understand it. They must be nuts." But all these observers have overlooked one very unusual condition in Alcoholics Anonymous. Unless each AA member follows to the best of his ability our suggested 12 steps of recovery, he almost certainly signs his own death warrant. Drunkenness and disintegration are not penalties inflicted by people in authority, they are results of personal disobedience to spiritual principles. We must obey certain principles, or we die. The same stern threat applies to the group itself. Unless there is approximate conformity to AA's 12 traditions, the group too can deteriorate and die. So we of AA do obey spiritual principles, first because we must and ultimately because we love the kind of life such obedience brings. Great suffering and great love are AA's disciplinarians, we have no others. Therefore it is now clear that we ought never to name boards to govern us. It is equally clear, however, that we shall always need to authorize workers to serve us. Here we discriminate between the spirit of vested authority and the spirit of service, concepts which are sometimes poles apart. It is in this spirit of service that we elect the AA group's informal rotating committees, the intergroup associations of the area, and the General Service Conference for AA as a whole. Even our trustees, once an independent body, are today directly accountable to our fellowship. They are the caretakers and expediters of our world services. Just as the aim of each AA member is personal sobriety, so the aim of our services is to bring sobriety within reach of all who want it. If nobody did the group's chores, if the area's telephone rang unanswered, if we did not reply to our mail, then AA as we know it would stop. Our communication lines with those who need our help would be broken. While AA has to function, it must at the same time avoid wealth, prestige, and power, three great dangers which necessarily tempt nearly all human societies. Though Tradition 9 at first sight seems to deal with purely practical matters, it embodies a deep spirituality in its actual operation. AA is a society without organization, animated only by the spirit of service, a true fellowship. How this unique situation developed is seen in the following example. Joe Doe goes to Middletown, USA. He is an AA member in good standing from another city. In Middletown there is no AA group. Joe feels lonesome and a little frightened. He also wants to carry the message. So maybe he puts an ad in the paper, saying that AA has come to town. Maybe he goes to the preachers and the doctors and bartenders and scrapes himself up a few prospects. Pretty soon there is a little group. At first Joe is the dictator and these first members are his hierarchy, literally. They have all the authority there is. This local founder and his friends teach AA principles and make all the group's arrangements. The group goes on growing broader and broader at the base. For a while they accept all that Joe and his friends say, they take directions, quite rightly, because at this stage there is no other way. But by and by something happens. Maybe Joe and his friends have a falling out, or maybe some power driver down in the base of the triangle begins to murmur, how long are these old-timers going to keep running this thing? Meanwhile the founder and his friends bask a little in glory. They say to one another, perhaps it would be a good idea if we continue to keep a firm hand on AA in this town. After all, we are experienced. Besides, look at all the good we have done those drunks. They should be grateful. True, founders and their friends are sometimes wiser and more humble than this. But often at this stage they are not. Growing pains now beset the group. Panhandlers panhandle. Lonely hearts pine. Problems descend. Murmurs are again heard in the body politic which swell into a loud cry, do these old-timers think they can run this thing forever? Let's have an election. The founder and his friends are hurt and depressed. They rush from crisis to crisis and from member to member, pleading. But it is no use. The revolution is on. The group is about to take over. If the founder and his friends serve well, they may, to their surprise, be reinstated for a time. If, however, they have heavily resisted the rising tide of democracy, they may be summarily beached. In either case, the group now has a so-called rotating committee, very sharply limited in its authority. In no sense whatever can its members govern or direct the group. Theirs is sometimes a thankless privilege of doing the group's chores. This committee can only make the necessary service arrangements by which the group can function. It can give no spiritual advice, judge no one's conduct, issue no orders. Any committee member may be promptly eliminated at the next election if he tries to throw his weight around. The members fully realize that they are actually servants, not senators. These are universal AA experiences. Thus throughout our fellowship does the group conscience decree the terms upon which its leaders shall serve. This brings us straight to the question, does AA have a real leadership? The answer is, yes, notwithstanding the apparent lack of it. Let's turn again to the deposed founder and his friends. What becomes of them? As their grief and anxiety wear away, a subtle change begins. Ultimately they divide into two classes known in AA slang as elder statesmen and bleeding deacons. The elder statesman is one who sees the wisdom of the group's decision, who holds no resentment over his reduced status, whose judgment, fortified by considerable experience, is sound, and who is willing to sit quietly on the sidelines patiently awaiting developments. The bleeding deacon is one who remains convinced that the group cannot get along without him, who constantly connives for re-election to office, and who continues to be consumed with self-pity. A few deacons hemorrhage so badly that they become drained of all AA spirit and principles and get drunk. At times the AA landscape seems to be littered with bleeding forms. Nearly every old-timer in our society has gone through this process in some degree. I have myself. Happily most of them survive and live to become elder statesmen. This is the real and enduring leadership of AA. Theirs is the quiet opinion, the sure knowledge, and the humble example that resolves a crisis. When sorely perplexed, the group inevitably turns to them for advice. They become the voice of the group conscience. They are, in fact, the true voice of Alcoholics Anonymous. They do not drive by mandate, they lead by example. This is how Tradition 9 was evolved. This is why AA can never be organized under any known form of government. But it also remains abundantly clear that we can, and must, create service boards or committees to be directly responsible to those they serve. Tomorrow afternoon, in this auditorium, the same drama of AA leadership will be reenacted for AA as a whole. The group conscience of Alcoholics Anonymous, as represented by your named and chosen General Service Conference, will take over the permanent care and custody of the organized world service of this entire fellowship. And in the spirit of Tradition 9, we old-timers will step aside, leaving with you only the offer of our advice if and when you want it. We shall no longer direct or govern, nor will anybody else. AA as such should always remain unorganized. It will fall then to your lot to guard this treasured principle. We think the future safety of Alcoholics Anonymous greatly depends upon Tradition 10, AA's principle of no controversy at the public level. This tradition reads as follows: Alcoholics Anonymous has no opinion on outside issues, hence the AA name ought never be drawn into public controversy. Since it began, Alcoholics Anonymous never has been divided by a major controversial issue. Our fellowship never has taken sides publicly on any question in this embattled world. This has been no earned virtue. It could almost be said that we were born with it, for as one old-timer recently declared, practically never have I heard a heated religious, political, or reform argument among AA members. So long as we don't argue these matters privately, it's a cinch we never shall argue them publicly. As by some deep instinct, we have known from the very beginning that, no matter what the provocation, we must never publicly take sides, as AAs, in any fight, even a worthy one. All history affords us the spectacle of striving nations and groups finally torn asunder because they were designed for, or tempted into, controversy. Others fell apart because of sheer self-righteousness while trying to force upon the rest of mankind some millennium of their own specification. In our own times we have seen millions die in political and economic wars, often spurred by religious and racial differences. We live in the imminent possibility of a fresh Holocaust to determine how men shall be governed and how the products of nature and toil shall be divided among them. That is the spiritual climate in which AA was born and by God's grace has flourished nevertheless. Let us re-emphasize that this reluctance to fight one another or anybody else is not counted as some special virtue which makes us feel superior to other people. Nor does it mean that the members of Alcoholics Anonymous, now restored as citizens of the world, are going to back away from their individual responsibilities to act as they see the right upon issues of our time. But when it comes to AA as a whole, that is a different matter. As AAs we do not enter into public controversy, because we know that our fellowship will perish if we do. We conceive the survival and spread of Alcoholics Anonymous to be something of greater importance than any weight we could collectively throw back of other causes. Recovery from alcoholism is life itself to us, and we wish to preserve in full strength our means of survival. Maybe this sounds as though the alcoholics in AA had suddenly gone peaceable, and had become one great big happy family. Of course this is not so at all. We are human beings and we squabble. Before we leveled off a bit, AA looked more like one prodigious squabble than anything else, at least on the surface. A corporation director who had just voted a company expenditure of $100,000 would appear at an AA business meeting and blow his top over an outlay of $25 worth of needed postage stamps. Disliking the attempt of some to manage the group, half of its membership might angrily rush off to form another group more to their liking. Elders, temporarily turned Pharisee, often sulked. Sometimes bitter attacks have been directed against people suspected of mixed motives. Yet despite their din, our rows have never done AA a particle of harm. They were just part and parcel of learning to work and live together. Let it be noted, too, that they were almost always concerned with how to make AA more effective, how to do the most good for the most alcoholics. The Washingtonian Society, a movement among alcoholics which started in Baltimore a century ago, almost discovered the answer to alcoholism. At first the society was composed entirely of alcoholics trying to help one another. The early members foresaw that they should dedicate themselves to this sole aim. In many respects the Washingtonians were akin to AA. Their membership passed the 500,000 mark. Had they stuck to their one goal, they might have found the full answer. Instead, the Washingtonians permitted politicians and reformers, both alcoholic and non-alcoholic, to use the society for their own purposes. Abolition of slavery, for example, was a stormy political issue then. Soon Washingtonian speakers violently and publicly took sides on this question. Maybe the society could have survived the abolition controversy, but it did not have a chance from the moment it determined to reform all America's drinking habits. Some of the Washingtonians became temperance crusaders. Within a very few years they had completely lost their effectiveness in helping alcoholics, and the society collapsed. The lesson to be learned from the Washingtonians was not overlooked by Alcoholics Anonymous. As we surveyed the wreck of that movement, early AA members resolved to keep our society out of public controversy. Considering how most of us have really loved controversy, this denial of the privilege of attacking something or somebody in public is no small achievement for the naturally aggressive people that we are. To make our survival as a fellowship sure, we have often gone far in the opposite direction. Years ago, for example, we stood in great fear of the misuse of the AA name by AAs and outside groups who wanted to use it for their own money-raising, controversial, or publicity purposes, and we reflected that the bigger AA grew, the greater this temptation would surely be. Therefore we felt we had to find a way legally to protect the precious name of our society. Our trustees were advised that this could be done only by incorporating the name Alcoholics Anonymous in every state of the Union and in all foreign countries. We actually began this tedious, complicated, and expensive task, which finally bogged down in a mass of technicalities, red tape, and charters. But the issue was revived with a bang when one of the large motion picture producers suddenly came up with a script for a picture which they were going to call Mr. and Miss Anonymous. The proposed portrayal of AA seemed pretty lopsided and in rather bad taste. Though they agreed to change the title, the company refused to do much of anything about the objectionable script. What, then, could we do about it? We concluded that we ought to ask for an injunction against the company for misuse of the AA name. This prospect of legal action caused the company to revise the script more to our liking. Otherwise, we might have sued, forgetting all about AA's principle of non-controversy in public. We were that excited. After this moving picture incident, our chairman, Bernard Smith, came up with what looked like a wonderful idea. As a lawyer, he thought Alcoholics Anonymous could easily obtain a congressional charter, an act of Congress which would protect the AA name everywhere. This would put us in the same class as the Red Cross and several other notable organizations. It was thought that the mere existence of such a charter would restrain nearly all those who might be tempted to misuse AA's name. And a legal bludgeon of this size and weight could easily be used on any who might still defy the law. It looked like a grand idea and we at the headquarters were all for it, but the conscience of Alcoholics Anonymous, its General Service Conference, had other ideas. The conference pointed out to us how foolish it would be to incorporate AA's way of life as a legal instrument with which to attack anyone, no matter what the provocation. We would not be content with such an instrument for purposes of pure restraint. Under enough provocation, we would be bound to start public lawsuits and thus enter the field of public controversy. It would be like building a war machine on the theory that it would always stay home and never fight. It would mean the legal organization of a fellowship whose traditions insisted on its being unorganized. The conference thought we ought to forget about the questionable advantages of legality and controversy and rely upon group and public opinion for our ultimate protection. After long debate, we at the headquarters saw that the conscience of Alcoholics Anonymous, acting through the delegates, was wiser than we were. So the Congress of the United States was never asked to incorporate AA. The moving resolution by which the conference took this action ought to be set on the record. It was drawn by Delegate Bob T., a Mississippi lawyer. Reporting for his committee, he said, "We have reviewed all of the arguments pro and con on this subject, have discussed it with many members of AA within the conference and outside of it, and we have come to these conclusions. 1. The evils which caused the question to arise have largely abated. 2. A congressional incorporation would create by law a power to govern which would be contrary to, and violative of, our traditions. 3. It would implement the spiritual force of AA with a legal power, which we believe would tend to weaken its spiritual strength. 4. When we ask for legal rights, enforceable in courts of law, we by the same act subject ourselves to possible legal regulation. 5. We might well become endlessly entangled in litigation which, together with the incidental expense and publicity, could seriously threaten our very existence. 6. Incorporation of AA could conceivably become the opening wedge that might engender politics and a struggle for power within our own ranks. 7. Continuously since its beginning, and today, AA has been a fellowship and not an organization. Incorporation necessarily makes it an organization. 8. We believe that spiritual faith and a way of life cannot be incorporated. 9. AA can and will survive so long as it remains a spiritual faith and a way of life open to all men and women who suffer from alcoholism. Thus the final foundation was laid for Tradition 10, Alcoholics Anonymous has no opinion on outside issues, hence the AA name ought never be drawn into public controversy. Tradition 11 grew out of a large and strenuous public relations experience. Today, it reads as follows: Our public relations policy is based on attraction rather than promotion. We need always maintain personal anonymity at the level of press, radio, and films. Without its legions of well-wishers, AA could never have grown as it has. Throughout the world, favorable publicity has been the principal means of bringing alcoholics into our fellowship. In AA offices, clubs, and homes, telephones ring constantly. One voice says, "I read a piece in the newspaper." Another, "We heard a radio program." And still another, "We saw a moving picture," or "We saw something about AA on television." It is no exaggeration to say that half of AA's membership has been led to us through channels like these. The inquiring voices are not all alcoholics or their families. Doctors read medical papers about AA and call for more information. Clergymen see articles in their church journals and also make inquiries. Employers learn that great corporations have set their approval upon us and wish to discover what can be done about alcoholism in their own firms. Therefore the responsibility fell upon us to develop the best possible public relations policy for Alcoholics Anonymous. Through many painful experiences we think we have arrived at what that policy ought to be. It is opposite in many ways to the usual promotional practice. We found that we had to rely upon the principle of attraction rather than promotion. Let's see how these two contrasting ideas, attraction and promotion, work out. A political party wishes to win an election and so it advertises the virtue of its leadership in order to draw votes. A worthy charity wants to raise money, and so its letterhead shows the names of every distinguished person whose support can be obtained. Much of the political, economic, and religious life of the world is dependent upon publicized leadership. People who symbolize causes and ideas fill a deep human need. We of AA do not question that. But we do have to face the fact that being in the public eye is hazardous, especially for us. By temperament many of us had been irresponsible promoters, and the prospect of a society composed largely of promoters was frightening. We knew we had to exercise self-restraint. The way this restraint paid off is interesting. It has resulted in more favorable publicity for Alcoholics Anonymous than could possibly have been obtained through all the arts and abilities of AA's best press agents. Obviously, AA had to be publicized somehow, so we resorted to the idea that it would be far better to let our friends do this for us. And they have done it to an amazing extent. Veteran newsmen, trained doubters that they are, have gone all out to carry AA's message. To them we are something more than the source of good stories. On almost every news front men and women of the press have become our friends. In the beginning they could not understand our refusal of all personal publicity. They were genuinely baffled by our insistence upon anonymity. But soon they got the point. Here was something rare in the world, a society which said it wished to publicize its principles and its work but not its individual members. The press was pleased with this attitude, and these friends ever since have reported AA with an enthusiasm which the most ardent members themselves could hardly match. There was actually a time when the press of America thought the anonymity of AA was better for us than some of our own members did. At one point about 100 of our society were breaking anonymity at the public level. With perfectly good intent, these folks declared that the principle of anonymity was horse and buggy stuff, something appropriate to AA's pioneering days. They were sure that AA could go faster and farther if it availed itself of modern publicity methods. AA, they pointed out, included many persons of local, national, or international fame. Provided they were willing, and many were, why shouldn't their membership be publicized, thereby encouraging others to join us? There were plausible arguments, but happily our friends of the writing profession disagreed with them. Years earlier our headquarters had written letters to practically every news outlet in North America, setting forth our public relations policy of attraction rather than promotion and emphasizing personal anonymity as AA's greatest protection. Since that time editors and rewrite men have repeatedly deleted names and pictures of members from AA copy. Frequently they have reminded ambitious individuals of AA's anonymity policy. They have even sacrificed good stories to this end. The force of their cooperation has helped beyond measure. Only a very few AA members are left who deliberately break anonymity at the public level. An old story, revealing several aspects of AA's public relations problem, comes to mind. One of our pioneer members conceived the idea of starting a group in his city by radio. The local station, with a radius of about 100 miles, offered to help. So our promoter friend constructed a series of 12 lectures on Alcoholics Anonymous. These were a strange mixture of AA and his own religious ideas. He soon put them on the air with all the vigor of a Chautauqua orator. Contrary to our expectations, he got a modest result. Inquiries came in and he started a group. Now flushed with success, he was smitten with a wonderful vision. He wrote headquarters, telling how a prominent life insurance company would sponsor him on a national network to deliver his 12 lectures. He was going to appear under his own name, as an AA member. For doing such a great work, of course, he was to receive a generous fee. We demonstrated, but it was no use. We advised him that the trustees felt his message inappropriate for national consumption. So he wrote a hot letter to this effect: "To hell with the trustees, the world is waiting for my message. I've got the right of free speech, and I'm going on the air whether you like it or not." This ultimatum was an alarming poser. It looked like promotion, professionalism, and anonymity breaking all in one package. If this sort of venture proved successful, from the promoter's point of view, every ad man and salesman in Alcoholics Anonymous would soon be selling AA's wares, willy-nilly. We would lose all control of our public relations. So headquarters took this tack. We assured our well-meaning friend that we would certainly uphold his right of free speech. But we added that he ought to uphold ours, too. We assured him that if his lectures went on the air, we would advise every AA group of the circumstances and ask them to write strong letters to the sponsoring life insurance company, letters of a kind the sponsor might not like to receive. The broadcast never went on the air. As a result of this incident, AA's trustees were empowered to conduct our overall public relations, and the principle of attraction rather than promotion became established as the key to our relation with the world about us. It is no accident that the original, long-form, draft of Tradition 11 carries the statement that, "It is better to let our friends recommend us." This in brief is the process by which AA's Tradition 11 was developed. To us it represents more than a sound public relations policy. It is more than a denial of self-seeking. Tradition 11 is certainly a constant reminder that personal ambition has no place in AA, but it also implies that each member ought to become an active guardian of our fellowship in its relation with the general public. As we have seen, anonymity is the protective mantle that covers our whole society. But it is more than protection, it has another dimension, a spiritual significance. And this leads to Tradition 12, which reads, "Anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all our traditions, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities." In my belief, the entire future of our fellowship hangs upon this vital principle. If we continue to be filled with the spirit and practice of anonymity, no shoal or reef can wreck us. If we forget this principle, the lid to Pandora's box will be off and the spirits of money, power, and prestige will be loosed among us. Obsessed by these evil genii, we might well founder and break up. I devoutly believe this will never happen. No AA principle merits more study and application than this one. I am positive that AA's anonymity is the key to long-time survival. The spiritual substance of anonymity is sacrifice. Because AA's 12 traditions repeatedly ask us to give up personal desires for the common good, we realize that the sacrificial spirit, well symbolized by anonymity, is the foundation of all these traditions. It is AA's proved willingness to make these sacrifices that gives people high confidence in our future. But in the beginning anonymity was not born of confidence, it was the child of our early fears. Our first nameless groups of alcoholics were secret societies. New prospects could find us only through a few trusted friends. The bare hint of publicity, even when it was not for ourselves but for our work, shocked us. Although we were no longer drinking, we still thought we had to hide from public distrust and contempt. When the Big Book appeared in 1939, we called it Alcoholics Anonymous. Its original foreword made this revealing statement: "It is important that we remain anonymous because we are too few, at present, to handle the overwhelming number of personal appeals which may result from this publication." Being mostly business or professional folks, we could not well carry on our occupations in such an event. Between these lines it is easy to read our fear that large numbers of incoming people might break our anonymity wide open. As the AA groups multiplied, so did anonymity problems. Excited over the spectacular recovery of a brother alcoholic, we would sometimes discuss intimate and harrowing aspects of his case that had been meant for his sponsor's ear alone. The aggrieved victim would then rightly declare that his trust had been broken. When reports of such cases got into circulation outside of AA, the resulting loss of confidence in our anonymity promise was severe. It sometimes turned people from us. Clearly, each AA member's name, and his story too, had to be kept confidential, if he wished it to be. This was our first lesson in the practical application of anonymity. On the other hand, however, with characteristically alcoholic intemperance, some of our newcomers cared not at all for personal anonymity. They wanted to shout about AA from the housetops, and did. Alcoholics barely dry in AA rushed about bright-eyed, buttonholing anyone who would listen to their stories. Others hurried to place themselves before microphones and cameras. Sometimes they got drunk and let their groups down with a bang. They had changed from AA members into AA show-offs. This phenomenon of contrast on the anonymity issue really set us thinking. Squarely before us was the question, how anonymous should an AA member be? Our growth made it plain that we could not be a secret society. But it was equally plain that we could not be a vaudeville circuit either. The charting of a safe path between these extremes took a long time. As a rule, the average newcomer wanted his family to know immediately what he was trying to do. He also wanted to tell others who had tried to help him, his doctor, his minister, and close friends. As he gained confidence, he felt it right to explain his new way of life to his employer and business associates. When opportunities to be helpful came along, he found he could talk easily about AA to almost anyone. These quiet disclosures helped him to lose his fear of the alcoholic stigma and to spread the news of AA's existence in his community. Many a new man and woman came to AA as a result of such conversations. Though not within the strict letter of anonymity, these communications were well within its spirit, but it became apparent that the word-of-mouth method of letting people know about AA was limited. Our work, as such, needed to be publicized. AA groups wanted quickly to reach as many despairing alcoholics as they could. Consequently, many groups began to hold meetings which were open to interested friends and to the public, so that the average citizen could see for himself just what AA was all about. The response to these meetings was warmly sympathetic. Soon groups began to receive requests for AA speakers to appear before civic organizations, church groups, and medical societies. Provided reporters present were cautioned against the use of full names or pictures, the result was fine. Then came our first few excursions into major publicity, and these were breathtaking. Cleveland's Plain Dealer articles about us ran that town's membership from a few dozen into hundreds overnight. The news stories of Mr. Rockefeller's dinner for Alcoholics Anonymous helped double our total membership in a year's time. Jack Alexander's famous Saturday Evening Post piece made AA a national institution. Such tributes as these brought opportunities for still more recognition. Other newspapers and magazines wanted AA stories. Film companies wanted to photograph us. Radio and finally television companies besieged us with requests for cooperation. What should we do? As this tidal offering of top public approval swept in, we realized that it could do us incalculable good or great harm. Everything would depend upon how it was channeled. We simply could not afford to take the chance of letting self-appointed members present themselves as messiahs representing AA before the whole public. The promoter instinct in us might be our undoing. If even one such person publicly got drunk or was lured into using AA's name for his own purposes, the damage might be irreparable. At this altitude, press, radio, films, and television, anonymity, 100% anonymity, was the only possible answer. Here principles would have to come before personalities, without exception. These experiences taught us that anonymity is real humility at work. It is an all-pervading spiritual quality which today keynotes AA life everywhere. Moved by the spirit of anonymity, we try to give up our natural desires for personal distinction as AA members both among fellow alcoholics and before the general public. As we lay aside these very human aspirations, we believe that each of us takes part in the weaving of a protective mantle which covers our whole society and under which we may grow and work in unity. We are sure that humility, expressed by anonymity, is the greatest safeguard that Alcoholics Anonymous can ever have. In recent years our awareness of the deep significance of anonymity has grown in a most heartening and wonderful way. At one time many numbers of AAs were breaking anonymity, and I was one of them. Today these numbers are reduced to a mere handful, despite our alcoholic yearnings for vainglory. This is a tremendous guarantee of even finer things to come. The kind of sacrifice that we shall always need to make is beautifully illustrated by a talk I recently had with a certain Texas lady. Her temptation was extreme because she is in show business and has great national popularity as an entertainer. This is what she told me: I sing in the best barrooms only, and I have been doing it for 15 years. Within a year after joining AA, I lost about 10 pounds, the bags came out from under my eyes, and I began to look like a human being. My manager couldn't figure it out, but at last I told him what had happened to me. At once, he said, "But aren't you and I going to tell the public about this?" "Why, this would make terrific publicity, both for AA and you too." "Well," I said, "temporarily I know that it would. Other people have proved that. But, Please, not for me. Alcoholics Anonymous has a principle called anonymity, no public big shots allowed. We know that AA can't be run like show business, no matter what the short-term benefits may be. AA saved my life and my career. Therefore the future welfare of Alcoholics Anonymous is more important to me than any publicity that I could get as an AA member. Then a little wistfully she added, "You know, Bill, I often see drunks in my audience and wonder how I can help them. If only I could tell them from the stage that I am in AA. But that would only be temporary, wouldn't it? In the long run, we'd all be ruined if everybody did it." I looked at the lady from Texas and was glad, very glad. Because I myself have always had strong tendencies toward the pursuit of prestige, wealth, and power, all of AA's traditions have borne down upon me with great force. You will remember that episode back in our living room on Clinton Street. That was the time when my group told me I could never become an AA professional. With nearly every tradition much the same thing has happened. At first, I obeyed because I had to. I would have lost my standing in AA if I had not. After a while I began to obey because I saw that the traditions were wise and right. While I conformed because it was right to do so, I still resisted inwardly. This was particularly true of anonymity. Today I hope I have come to a time in my AA life when I can obey because I really want to obey, because I really want the traditions for myself as well as for AA as a whole. Therefore each of our 12 traditions is really an expression of the deflation that each of us has to take, of the sacrifice that we shall all have to make in order to live and work together. Dr. Bob was essentially a far more humble person than I. In some ways he was a sort of spiritual, natural, and this anonymity business came rather easily to him. He could not understand why some people should want so much publicity. In the years before he died, his personal example respecting anonymity did much to help me keep my own lid on. I think of one affecting instance in particular, one that every AA ought to know. When it was sure that Dr. Bob was mortally afflicted, some of his friends suggested that there should be a suitable monument or mausoleum erected in honor of him and his wife Anne, something befitting a founder and his lady. Of course this was a very natural and moving tribute. The committee went so far as to show him a sketch of the proposed edifice. Telling me about this, Dr. Bob grinned broadly and said, "God bless them. They mean well. But for heaven's sake, Bill, let's you and I get buried just like other folks." A year after his passing, I visited the Akron cemetery where Dr. Bob and Ann lie. The simple stone says not a word about Alcoholics Anonymous. Some people may think that this wonderful couple carried personal anonymity too far when they so firmly refused to use the words, Alcoholics Anonymous, even on their own burial stone. For one, I do not think so. I think that this moving and final example of self-effacement will prove of more permanent worth to AA than any amount of public attention or any great monument.